The rain falls in heavy sheets over the ancient stones of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Compound, Jerusalem, July 21,951. A 15-year-old boy in a crisp military uniform stands beside his grandfather King Abdullah of Jordan as they step from Friday prayers. The air smells of incense and damp earth. The courtyard is full worshippers in white kefi as guards in pressed uniforms, journalists with cameras slung around their necks. It looks from the outside like any ordinary Friday. Then, without warning, a figure emerges from the shadows near the gate. 3 sharp reports split the sacred quiet. Abdullah crumples his white robe stained crimson before he reaches the ground. The boy Prince Hussein feels a sudden sting at his chest. A bullet has deflected off the metal pinned there, the very one his grandfather had insisted he wear that morning. The guards converge in seconds. The attacker is brought down immediately. Hussein survives shaken unscathed, left with nothing but a dented medal and a king slipping away in his arms. He would later say he never forgot the weight of that moment, not the chaos, not the shouting, but the specific silence that followed. The way everyone seemed to hold their breath at once. The way a dynasty's future balanced for a few seconds on a single deflected bullet. This is the moment the Hashemite shadow tightens its visible grip on a family that claims descent from the Prophet Muhammad himself, a lineage that carries divine legitimacy and in equal measure extracts a relentless price in loss and betrayal. That boy would become King Hussein, the longest reigning monarch in the modern Middle East. A man who outlasted more than 24 attempts on his life, from meals quietly poisoned in his own kitchens to aircraft tampered on the tarmac and cars wired beneath the chassis. Yet the dynasty's public face remained immaculate palaces in Amman, with marble halls, fleets of armored Mercedes-Benz 600 Pullman limousines, gliding through desert highways, state banquets, held beneath crystal chandeliers. What that image concealed was a private history written in grief, where power is not passed down peacefully, but clawed from the edge of ruin and sometimes turned against one's own blood. If the weight of that 1951 scene still lingers with you, drop a comment below which royal family's hidden fractures fascinate you most, and why your thoughts help shape what we uncover next. The rise of the Hashemites traces back to the Arabian deserts of the early 20th century, when Sharif Hussein bin Ali, great-grandfather of our modern kings, ruled Mecca as guardian of Islam's holiest sites. He was a man of considerable political instinct, navigating the crumbling Ottoman Empire with the patience of someone who understood that empires rarely fall cleanly, they fracture slowly, and the opportunist who waits in exactly the right place inherits the pieces. In 1916, he launched the Arab Revolt against Ottoman rule, backed by British gold and sweeping promises of an independent Arab kingdom, stretching from Damascus to Mecca. T.E. Lawrence rode alongside his sons Faisal and Abdullah through desert campaigns that have since been romanticized into legend. The reality was bloodier and more complicated: tribal negotiations, shifting loyalties, supply lines that collapsed in the heat, men who fought for a vision of Arab sovereignty that the European powers had already privately agreed to divide among themselves. Those promises dissolved at Versailles. The French absorbed Syria. The British installed Faisal as king of Iraq, a throne constructed for political convenience rather than organic legitimacy. Abdullah received what history would remember as a consolation prize: the newly invented Emirate of Transjordan, a desert buffer state with no oil, few resources, and hostile neighbors pressing on every side. Sharif Hussein bin Ali himself died in exile in Cyprus in 1931, the founding ambition of his revolt, reduced to borders drawn by men in European suits who had never crossed the desert. It was a pattern the family would come to know well. Grand aspirations, partial victories, and the slow recognition that the world beyond the Arabian Peninsula operated according to its own calculus, one in which Hashemite dreams were useful tools, not guaranteed outcomes. Abdullah I built what he could from what he had. He moved his court to Ammon, then little more than a sleepy Circassian village of white stone houses and goat herds. He raised modest palaces, the Raghadan with its domed ceilings, antique furniture, imported from Damascus, the Basman where family dinners unfolded beneath portraits of ancestors going back generations. Wealth came not from extravagance, but from diplomacy, British subsidies, later American aid and alliances managed with patience and precision. Abdullah was by most accounts a man of genuine cultural sophistication. He wrote poetry. He received guests from across the Arab world in his modest court and cultivated the image of a ruler rooted in tradition, rather than the imported luxury that would define later Arab monarchies. His palaces were comfortable, but not ostentatious, a deliberate signal in a region where legitimacy still rested on religious standing and tribal respect, rather than the spectacle of wealth. His ambitions, though, reached further than his resources allowed. Abdullah dreamed of uniting the Arabs under Hashemite leadership, perhaps absorbing parts of Palestine or engineering a greater Syrian federation under his own house. He maintained quiet back-channel contacts with Zionist leadership in the late 1940s, calculating that a negotiated arrangement with Israel might serve Hashemite interests better than the pan-Arab war his neighbors were demanding. Those contacts made him deeply unpopular in certain quarters. In some circles, they marked him as a traitor to the Arab cause. That ambition, that willingness to pursue his own strategic vision regardless of regional consensus, was in the end what brought him to the floor of Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1951. Hussein inherited the throne at 17, still warm from his grandfather's fall. Educated at Harrow and Sandhurst, he spoke flawless English, flew his own planes and rode motorcycles through Ammon's streets with the restlessness of a young man who understood instinctively that stillness was its own kind of danger. He was not naturally a man of caution. He raced cars on desert roads. He piloted jets himself sometimes without informing his security detail. He descended unannounced into coffee shops in Amman's downtown, sitting with ordinary Jordanians. In a gesture that was partly theater and partly genuine, he seemed to genuinely find formal court ritual suffocating. The informality was strategic as much as temperamental. In a country where the throne rested on Bedouin tribal loyalty, rather than oil revenue or institutional depth, a king who could be seen and touched carried a different kind of authority than one who ruled from behind palace walls. But survival also demanded calculation. In 1957, facing his first serious internal coup by pro-Nasser army officers who saw the young king as a British puppet, Hussein moved with a decisiveness that surprised even his allies. He dismissed the army commander overnight, exiled the principal conspirators before they could coordinate, and flew personally to tribal leaders in the desert south to reinforce personal bonds of loyalty with the Bedouin units that formed the monarchy's reliable core. It worked. The coup dissolved before it fully formed. By the 1960s, Jordan's royal motorcade featured custom Rolls-Royce Phantoms with reinforced chassis, glass tinted dark against the desert sun, and drivers schooled in evasive maneuvers, not as luxury, but as operational necessity. The threats never stopped coming. Poisoned nose drops placed in his personal medicine cabinet by Egyptian intelligence discovered before use. A Syrian Air Force MiG that intercepted his private plane over the desert. Hussein himself, at the controls, outmaneuvered it and landed safely. Plots within the army, within the palace, within the family's extended circle. Each attempt survived. Each survival, mythologized slightly further into the aura of a man fate, seemed determined to keep alive however much the world conspired otherwise. The dynasty's golden hour stretched through the late 1970s. Hussein, now in his 40s, had endured wars that would have ended lesser rulers. The 1967 Six-Day War was by any measure a catastrophe. The West Bank and Jerusalem lost in less than a week of fighting against an Israeli military operating at the height of its preparation. Hussein had hesitated before joining the Arab coalition, knowing Jordan's forces were outmatched, but the political cost of standing aside felt equally unsurvivable. He committed lost and spent the following decade absorbing the consequences: a flood of Palestinian refugees, a shattered military, and a truncated country whose most historically significant territory now sat behind an Israeli ceasefire line. Then came 1970 Black September, when Palestinian Fedayeen under Yasser Arafat transformed Amman itself into a theater of armed conflict. Planes were hijacked and brought to Jordanian airstrips. Royal palace grounds were shelled. The state's authority over its own capital had essentially collapsed in certain districts. Hussein, after weeks of attempted negotiation, ordered the army to restore order. Jordanian tanks moved through the city's outskirts. Heavy fire fell on PLO strongholds in the refugee camps and urban strongholds where the Fedayeen had established parallel governance. The toll was staggering. Estimates of those who did not survive range from 3,000 to 15,000 Palestinians, and Jordanians' numbers still disputed and politically charged today. Syrian armor crossed the northern border in support of the Fedayeen. Hussein called President Nixon, who authorized U.S. intervention if the situation deteriorated further. Israel quietly signaled it would also move against Syrian forces if needed. The combination of pressure worked. The Syrians pulled back. The PLO retreated, eventually relocating to Lebanon, where they would ignite the next catastrophe in a different country. Jordan held, but the cost was visible in the rubble of Zarqe and the widows, who lined streets in black abayas, and in a king who now kept a pistol beneath his pillow every night because the line between external enemy and internal threat had proven thinner than anyone cared to admit. Into this world stepped Lisa Halaby in 1976, an American architect of Arab-Swedish descent, recruited by Royal Jordanian Airlines to work on urban development projects in Amman. She came from a different world, entirely Princeton-educated, professionally independent, accustomed to being taken seriously on her own terms, rather than through the reflected status of a husband or father. She encountered the 43-year-old king, still navigating private grief. Queen Alia Hussein's third wife, enormously popular for her warmth and her genuine engagement with ordinary Jordanians, had been lost the previous year when her helicopter's rotors failed over the desert south of Amman. The wreckage scattered across open sand. Hussein had been, by multiple accounts, genuinely devastated, not performing the grief expected of a monarch, but carrying it personally, visibly, in a way that made his court uncomfortable with its rawness. Their courtship was quiet, almost incongruously so, given the scale of the world they both inhabited. Shared flights over Jordan's extraordinary archaeological sites, Petra's rose-red cliffs, the Roman ruins at Jerash, the desert castles of the Umayyad period. Conversations about architecture and urban planning in palace gardens, heavy with jasmine after the evening heat broke. Motorcycle rides on Harleys through the wadis at dusk, when the desert light turned everything copper and the noise of Amman fell away entirely. She spent 18 days in careful reflection before converting to Islam. They married in June 1978, no tiaras, no ceremonial diamond exchange, simply an ivory gown and a veil held by flower ribbons. She became Queen Noor al-Hussein, Light of Hussein. Their years together appeared from the outside genuinely gilded. 4 children arrived in the early 1980s: Hamza first, then Hashim, Iman, and Raya, growing up between the formal rituals of palace life and the outdoor freedoms their parents both seemed to genuinely prefer. Noor channeled her energy into causes that went beyond the ceremonial women's education initiatives, refugee camp welfare along the Syrian and Iraqi borders, environmental restoration projects in the Jordan Valley that addressed the country's genuine and worsening water crisis. She brought to the role a directness that was not always comfortable within traditional palace culture, but which gave her a credibility in international humanitarian circles that purely ceremonial royal consorts rarely achieve. On the public stage, the family projected cohesion state visits to Washington in motorcades flanked by motorcycle outriders, banquets under chandeliers dripping Swarovski crystals, Noor wearing the diamond sunburst tiara, whose rays echoed her very name, light fracturing into thousands of sparks across marble floors. Hussein remained the consummate diplomatic survivor, navigating the Oslo period, maintaining Jordan's delicate position between Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and the Arab states with the instincts of someone who had been doing this longer than most of his counterparts had been in power. Beneath that surface, shadows were quietly deepening. From the mid-1990s, Hussein fought non-Hodgkin's lymphoma through cycles of treatment that extracted their own visible toll. He traveled repeatedly to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, away from the desert light he loved, away from the motorcycles and the cockpits, submitting to a different kind of fight that offered no evasive maneuver and no diplomatic solution. In January 1999, from that hospital bed, he made his most wrenching decision. For 34 years, his brother Hassan had served as crown prince, steady intellectual, respected internationally for his interfaith dialogue work and his policy depth. Hassan had managed the kingdom's affairs competently during Hussein's extended absences for treatment. Many inside the palace assumed the succession was settled. It was not. With weeks remaining, Hussein stripped away Hassan's title in a letter that was, by the standards of dynastic correspondence, remarkably personal in its reproach, expressing frustration with Hassan's management of palace staff and his relationship with the queen. He named his eldest son from his second marriage, Abdullah, then a major general in the Jordanian Special Forces, trained at Sandhurst, like his father, steady and military bred, as his successor. Hassan received the news, as the world did, through official channels after the decision was already final. Hamza, Noor's 18-year-old son and Hussein's acknowledged favorite, the one who most resembled his father in face and temperament, the one Hussein had personally tutored in the art of Bedouin engagement and tribal diplomacy, was passed over without explanation given publicly. Hussein died on February 7, 1999. In Amman, family gathered close the machinery of modern medicine, marking the final distance. Abdullah ascended at 37. The transition felt orderly at first. Abdullah retained Hamza as crown prince briefly before quietly removing the title in 2004, citing a need for Hamza to pursue other duties, a phrase that in the language of palace politics carries its own unmistakable weight. Noor stepped back into private advocacy, the King Hussein Foundation, nuclear disarmament forums, refugee policy platforms, where her credibility as a former queen gave her access that pure NGO workers could not command. The arrangement looked from the outside like a dignified, managed withdrawal. The wound, though, had not closed it, had simply stopped being visible. The fracture returned with full force on April 3, 2021. Security forces enclosed Hamza's palace in Amman in the early hours. 19 arrests followed across the kingdom, sweeping up palisades, tribal figures, and a former royal court chief. The government leveled accusations of sedition, specifically that Hamza had coordinated with foreign actors to incite unrest at a moment when Jordan was already strained by economic deterioration, pandemic pressures, and public anger over elite corruption. Hamza pushed back through a video recorded and leaked to international media phone lines, severed internet-cut guards posted at the gates. He recorded it standing before a portrait of his father, voice measured but carrying weight that no prepared statement could have conveyed. Noor responded on X with language that made no concession to diplomatic courtesy, praying that truth and justice will prevail for all the innocent victims of this wicked slander. God bless and keep them safe. The immediate crisis was brokered through senior family mediation, a loyalty pledge, a public statement, the machinery of dynastic conflict management performing its function. But the resolution was cosmetic. A 2022 royal decree formalized the underlying reality: residence confinement, restricted communications visits, accounted for and monitored. Through 2023 and into 2026, what had been framed as a temporary security measure hardened into something with no visible endpoint. No public appearances. Social media absent. The former crown prince, once groomed for the throne by the father who called him his favorite, reduced to a name that the kingdom's official narrative no longer has occasion to mention. As recently as February 2026, Noor appealed publicly for her son's release, citing years of what she described as arbitrary detention, stretching now beyond 5 years against a backdrop of regional wars that made her fear for his physical safety. The response from the palace was silence, which in this context carries its own fluency. The Hashemite wealth persists. The palaces are maintained their marble, clean their gardens watered against the desert's insistence. The diplomatic jets sit fueled on Amman's tarmac. The influence in Washington and Riyadh, built across decades of patient positioning, is carefully tended by a king who has proven more durable in office than many predicted when he inherited a throne he had not expected to receive. But the private ledger tells a different story than the public accounts. Abdullah, I brought down in a house of worship by a man who stepped from the shadows during Friday prayers. Alia taken when a rota failed over empty sand, leaving behind a country that genuinely mourned, and a husband who carried that loss into every subsequent chapter of his life. Hussein himself, worn through by illness, after decades of outlasting everyone who had marked him for removal, making his final succession decision not from the serenity of resolution, but from the clinical distance of a hospital room thousands of miles from the palace he built his life inside. Hassan, a crown prince of 34 years, receiving his removal as fact rather than conversation. Hamza, born into the warmth of a love story that the world found genuinely moving shape from childhood, for a role the dynasty ultimately chose to deny him now, a man in his early 40s living under conditions that no official communique describes with precision. That is the quiet truth the Hashemite public image has never fully been able to contain. Power here elevates to palaces of marble and gold, genuine ones, not the metaphorical kind. It brings diplomatic access, military loyalty, the deference of nations that need Jordan to remain stable, and therefore need the throne to remain standing. And then with the same force, it carves away the people beside you, turning sons into liabilities, brothers, into risks, trust into a luxury that no throne anywhere in the world has ever managed to sustain in its inner circle across generations. The Hashemites still rule. They still walk the knife edge of Middle Eastern geopolitics, with the practiced balance of those who have understood since 1951 that the alternative to balance is the courtyard floor. The alliances hold the diplomacy, continues the palace lights remain on. But the shadow persists, moving with the sun stretching longest in the hours that look brightest from the outside. Every crown casts one. The only question is how long it takes to notice yours. What would you trade for such a throne? Or is the more honest question whether the throne once claimed ever truly agrees to let go?